So a common question that has been asked to me a few times since I started my Bargain Game Hunter series on this channel is, why do you spend so much time finding games and trading them into GameStop? Well, I'm going to go over that as well as some tips and tricks on how you can get the most out of your GameStop trade-ins in the first ever episode of Bargain Game Hunting 101. So, welcome to this brand new series on the BigCTV Plays channel. This is kind of a spin-off to the Bargain Game Hunter series that I've been doing for quite a few years now. So, the idea behind the series, before we dive too deep, is to give everybody kind of an instructional, but also just tips and tricks on how to succeed in game hunting, because it seems like it'd be something that's very simple, but in all honesty, there are definitely some tips and tricks that you can use to make the most out of your time game hunting. So we're going to dive deep into a number of different subjects on this series. But before we go any further, if you enjoy game hunting content and want to learn more, whether you're new at it or something you're considering getting into, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. I've posted 100+ episodes of my Bargain Game Hunter series, and especially if you want to see how I kind of developed my craft. If you watch the first few episodes, I wasn't great. And then as we went along, I got a lot better at it because I learned different tips, tricks, and techniques. And I'm hoping to share those with you. So, free of charge, of course. This isn't locked behind any kind of paywall. The channel's monetized, but I haven't made a dime off of it yet because I just haven't had enough views. So, if you enjoy this content, hey, hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. That way that way I know that you appreciate the videos, and hopefully you can find some stuff that'll help you out in your game hunting journey. So before we dive too deep in GameStop, I want to do a quick overview of what is game hunting, because this is the first episode, so some people might not know what's going on. So game hunting is essentially going out to various locations searching for video games. Pretty straightforward, right? You know, you might have heard of other YouTubers going out to thrift shops, pawn shops, flea markets, garage sales, you name it, people do it. They go out to whatever location they can to find cheap or underpriced video games. Now, of course, people game hunt for different reasons. Some people do it to resell. No judgment, nothing wrong with that. If that's how you make your money, cool. Some people, like myself, do it to build a collection. So the vast majority of the games that I pick up personally, I either want to add to my collection because I don't have them. It's an upgrade on a game that I have. So like if I have a loose disc copy of a game and I find a complete copy, I might pick it up to replace that loose disc copy. Or I get them to flip to add more games or more funds to my game hunting collection. And that's where GameStop comes in. So one of the big questions that people ask a lot, and I alluded to this a little bit in the intro, is why would you find games to trade into GameStop rather than selling them online on a website like eBay or Mercari or Facebook Marketplace? And there's a few reasons to that. Let me walk you through the process on how to sell a game on eBay. Now, obviously, this isn't quite the same. I've never sold on Mercari. I have attempted to sell something on Facebook Marketplace. I haven't gotten a single sale from it. But I have sold quite a few items on eBay, so at least I'm familiar with that process. So in order to sell an item on eBay, obviously you have to first acquire the item, then you have to create a listing. That usually involves taking pictures of the item, writing an accurate description of the item, including any flaws or blemishes, because I will tell you this, video game collectors can often be very picky, especially if the item is a collector's item, and especially if the item is fetching a premium price. So you need to be careful when creating your listing that you are not saying anything misleading, or that you're not glossing over a major flaw. Because eBay does have a policy where if the buyer claims that you misled them or that you did not disclose all accurate information, they will accept a return, no questions asked, even if you do not elect to accept returns, and force you to repay the buyer. So you have to be very accurate when it comes to your descriptions on your eBay listings. So you do your listing, then you can post it. There are a couple options there. You can either post it for free, which means if people are actively searching for it, they might come across it. Or you can also promote it, where essentially you pay eBay a small portion of your sale to have that as a promoted listing. If it's a more valuable game, that's oftentimes the best way to go. Like if it's an item that's worth, $100+, it might be worth doing a promoted listing so that way people will actually see it. I mean, if it's a popular game, then sometimes you don't need to promote it, but it really just depends on the situation. Then you have to wait until somebody buys your item. That could take a while. Sometimes it could take days. Sometimes if it's a really popular item, it'll sell same day. I've had items where I post it and it sells within minutes. But I've also had items that just never sold, and I had to keep dropping the price. And that's the other thing too, you have to keep up with your listing. So if your item's been sitting there for a week and you haven't sold it, and people just start looking at it, it means you gotta make a change. Whether it's lowering the price, accepting offers, maybe changing up the photos to make them a little more interesting. I mean, there's a number of things you can do to try to fix your listing and make it a little more palatable to buyers. Once your item finally sells, then you have to package it up. And again, depends on the type of item, how you would package. Most video games, unless it's a valuable game or a collector's item, you can put in like a media mail, like bubble mailer. That's usually what I do. Some people aren't the biggest fan of that just because there's not a whole lot of padding. I always try to get some that have at least a little bit of padding in there because, I mean, game cases are fairly resilient, but you never know what's going to happen in the mail. You can also just buy some bubble wrap and wrap it like that. It really just depends on, how far in that extra mile you want to go. Then you have to ship the item out. Of course, you have the option to charge the buyer shipping or offer free shipping. Of course, if you offer free shipping, that means that you're paying for shipping out of your own pocket or out of your proceeds. And if the buyer pays for it, then it's included in the cost. So basically, your listing plus whatever you listed as shipping. Sometimes people aren't interested in paying for shipping. I always charge a flat rate for my shipping, which can be good, can be bad. It's good when it's a place that would have been cheaper if you just did a calculated rate. But it's bad if, let's say you're shipping it to California or Alaska and you're on the East Coast. Then you're gonna have to pay some extra to get shipped. But regardless, then you have to go ship it. Of course, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can go to the post office, you could get stamps, however you want to ship it. And then when the buyer receives the game, they can return it if it's deemed, something's wrong with it, or they claim that not everything was disclosed. So there's a whole lot involved when it comes to selling a game on eBay. But here's the real kicker. You're not going to get your payment until probably a good 3-4 days after you ship it, or after it sells. And when you do, eBay automatically takes a chunk of it because you're listing it on their website. You also have to cover shipping if you did a free shipping listing. And if you promoted it, they take an additional amount. So you're not left with nearly as much as you probably wanted. So I won't necessarily say it's the worst idea to sell certain games on eBay. It just depends on what they are. If it's an expensive game or a rare game or a collector's edition, absolutely that's the best method to sell that game, is to sell it online. If it's a more common game that you're only going to be selling, that you're trying to get like 20 bucks for, you're probably only going to get like 13. So if that's the case, why go through all that hassle when you can take that game to GameStop and get maybe not quite that amount, but pretty close to it, and immediately, rather than having to wait for it to sell. So that's part of why oftentimes when I go game hunting, unless I find like a super valuable game just out of the blue, which doesn't happen super often. It has happened, but it doesn't happen super often. So unless you're finding some random really valuable game out in the wild, oftentimes it's better to trade in a game to a game store than to sell it online. So now when it comes to trading into game stores, obviously if you have a local game store, I would check there first, because oftentimes local game stores have a little less overhead, and sometimes they can offer you a bit more in trading credit. Sometimes they have more things they can offer you to use that trading credit on. However, I live in an area where there aren't really any local game stores. We just have GameStop. And that's how a lot of part of the country are. There's a lot of places where you just have GameStop. So this is kind of a guide for those people. If you don't have a local store nearby, if you don't want to sell at a flea market or at a garage sale, then why not take those games that you don't want, or take games that have some value that you want to try to gain additional value out of, trade it into GameStop, and use that credit to get stuff you do want. That's kind of the play. So I'm going to go through step by step on the best ways to make the most out of your trade-ins for GameStop. Step one, of course, you need the GameStop app or GameStop website. Either one works. GameStop has a whole page dedicated to trade-ins. So when you are out game hunting, you want to have this page pulled up and ready to go, because that is going to be the best indicator as to what games are worth picking up and what games are not. So have that page pulled up ready to go when you're sifting through games at your local pawn shop or thrift shop or flea market or garage sale. If your intention is to flip them to GameStop, have that website pulled up. You can search the game, type in the title, make sure you select the proper platform, because platform does matter a lot on GameStop's website, and it will show you the trading credit amount. The second tip, and this one is also very important, get the Pro membership. I know pretty much every time you go into a GameStop, you're always going to have the game advisor talking about, you should get a Pro membership. You should get a Pro membership. You really should. It pays for itself pretty much instantly. You get additional credit when you're trading in games and you have a Pro membership. By default, it's 10%. And if there's special events, like sometimes there's events called trade days where you can get way more credit, you usually get your 10% on top of that. So even if your only intention is to trade in games at GameStop, not necessarily shop at GameStop all the time, the Pro membership is worth getting. You also get a $5 coupon every month, which you could use on either, a free $5 game or put it towards a bigger game. It's just worth it. So you might as well get it. It helps out in the long run for sure. So now that you know that, when you're out game hunting, how do you know what games you want to pick up? Of course, the first thing is, when you find a game that looks interesting, look on the GameStop website. There are some key factors. A lot of it is going to come down to, especially when you're first starting out, you're probably not going to know what to look for. And that's common. When you've been doing this for a while, there are certain games where as soon as you see them, you know they have some value. And you know that you can flip them to GameStop for a profit, if you can buy it for the right price. But when you're first starting out, just look up everything. You know, find a game, look up its price, maybe jot it down if you need a reminder. But you want to have a good idea as to how much a game is trading in for before you pull the trigger and buy it. So that's an important step when it comes to trading in. Now, there are certain types of games that are always going to have value pretty much no matter what. Nintendo games. If it's published by Nintendo, for the most part, there are a few exceptions. There are some Nintendo games that are worth absolutely nothing, but there are some that are always worth something. One of the classic examples, Wii Sports. Wii Sports is as common as water on Earth. You can find Wii Sports everywhere. GameStop takes it for $8.80. Most places, because of how common Wii Sports is, you can probably get it for pennies on the dollar. I find it all the time for $2 or $3 a piece. And then I can just flip it to GameStop and make a $5 profit or more. I'm going to talk about one of my other steps. So, Nintendo games. Most games on the Switch tend to have a little bit higher of a trade-in value. Not all, but most do. On the flip side, with some exceptions, Xbox One is typically worth less than PlayStation. I think it's, again, just because GameStop tends to sell more PlayStation copies of games than they do on Xbox. So if you happen to find a game on PlayStation and a game on Xbox and you can only get one or the other, more than likely the PlayStation copy is going to be worth a little bit more. Again, not all the time, but a good chunk of the time. And then, you know, just do your research. Obviously, newer games are going to hold their value a bit more unless it's a rare or more valuable game. Also, super common games that everybody owns are probably not going to be worth a lot. For instance, if you find a copy of Grand Theft Auto 5 on the Xbox 360, you're not going to get much for that. That's as common as they come. Everybody's traded that in. Same with Grand Theft Auto 5 on the Xbox One or PS4 at this point. Like, those used to have some pretty good value and you used to be able to find them everywhere and flip them for a decent amount. Not anymore. That game is very old. It has come out on PS5 and Series X since then. It's not worth anything, so don't bother. But again, when you're first starting out, the best thing to do is just look up everything. Try to find newer games, Nintendo games. If it's a game you don't see very often, that seems kind of uncommon, look it up on a GameStop's website, but also look it up on eBay, because sometimes it might be worth more selling it on there. Now, one trick I will tell you, if you find a game that's worth a surprisingly large amount that isn't a first-party Nintendo game, check price charting. And I always recommend this as well when it comes to less common games. Price charting is another source that a lot of people use. Basically, it tells you the market price of certain games. So if you happen to stumble upon a game that trades in the GameStop for like $40, check price charting, because that, instead of being $40, you might be able to sell that game for like $150 online. So don't flip it to GameStop if it's worth a lot of money. So now you kind of have an idea of what to look for. The next step is going to be buying it for the right price. And this basically is just a matter of negotiation. So it depends on how you are sourcing your games or game hunting. Obviously, every location has its positives and its negatives. So for instance, garage sales, pawn shops, flea markets sometimes, but mostly garage sales and pawn shops oftentimes you can negotiate with the seller and try to get a little bit better of a price. Thrift shops, at least most of the ones that I've been to, and flea markets are typically fairly fixed. It's just like a flat rate. Now, sometimes you can do better on flat rates. Sometimes they're worse. It depends. But the main thing you want to be looking for when it comes to you finding games is making sure you're going to make a profit when it comes to trading in. So for instance, let's say I find a game like Call of Duty Black Ops 2. That used to be my bread and butter. Anytime I found a copy of that, I would instantly grab it because it traded in for like $9 on the 360. It's come back down to earth. Now it's worth about $5.50 in trading credit. If I find Black Ops 2, I want to buy it for less than $5. And even then, $5 might not be worth it. There are some exceptions to that, which we'll go over in a second. But we want to try to find it so that you're going to make a profit when you trade it into GameStop. Because what's the point in going through that if you're just going to break even? So you always want to try to make sure you're buying a game for less than what its trade-in value is. Then you can flip it to GameStop. And ideally, there's also a promotion going on, which is another topic we'll talk about in a second, which means you'll gain even more money. So you always want to aim to buy a game for less than the trade-in value. The main exceptions to this are going to be games that have a large amount of trade-in value when there's a big promotion. So like I mentioned earlier, sometimes GameStop does big trade promotions. And if you happen to find a game that is worth a lot, even if you have to buy it at pretty much what it's worth, sometimes the promotion is enough to make it worthwhile. So for instance, I had a few instances where they did trade days, which gave you 50% extra credit. I would find a copy of, let's say, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on the Switch. If a pawn shop wanted to sell that to me for $30, normally that's not a great deal because GameStop would take it for like $35. So I mean, yeah, it's still a $5 profit, but it's not like a huge bump up. However, because it was trade days, I would get an additional $15 in credit. So then it turns into $20 bonus. Absolutely, it's worth picking up. So it really just depends on what's going on. But you always want to try to buy whatever you're buying under the trading credit value, with that one exception. So I'm actually in the middle of editing this video right now, and I had a point that I didn't mention that I feel I absolutely should have. I don't know why I didn't talk about this in my original video. I just didn't think about it. And that is condition. So one of the important things you want to check whenever you're buying, especially from a pawn shop or a thrift shop or anybody really, is check the condition of the games. This is another topic that I'll go into in more detail when I talk about various destinations where you can go game hunting, because we're going to do a deep dive on all of those eventually. But you always want to check the condition, and specifically in regards to GameStop, there's a couple important things. First of all, GameStop does not care whether you have a case or not. So a lot of times, especially if you're looking to sell a game online, you're probably not going to want loose copies unless it's like a super expensive game or it's a highly desired game. GameStop doesn't care. So if you find a loose disc copy of a game that's worth $5, it's still worth $5, regardless of whether it has a case or not. And sometimes if you want to get really creative, you can technically find a copy of a game with the case, trade in the game, and just keep the case. And some people even sell the cases by themselves, and they can get some money back for just the case. So it depends on how ambitious you want to be. Or if you just need additional cases, like if you have loose games in your collection that need cases, keep the case, trade in the game by itself. GameStop doesn't care. They'll just make a new case for it. So good thing to note. Now, another important thing to note is when it comes to disc-based games especially, you want to make sure that they're pretty clean when it comes to condition. If a game is super scratched up, GameStop will charge a refurb fee. And depending on what the game is and how valuable it is, that could do a major dent in the amount of credit that you get back. So definitely check the condition of all games that you pick up to flip to GameStop, especially disc-based games. It's less of a problem with cartridge-based stuff like Switch or DS or 3DS. But when it comes to disc-based games, check all the discs, especially with non-Blu-ray systems. So PS2, Xbox 360, Wii, definitely check those discs, especially because they're much more susceptible to scratching than a Blu-ray disc on like a PS3, a PS4, Xbox One. Those are a little less susceptible to scratching, but the non-Blu-ray disc-based consoles, definitely check the discs. Wii U as well. Make sure there's not a lot of scratching. I would also, if possible, clean your discs before you trade them in. I know sometimes that's not always able to happen. I know I've had times where I went straight from the pawn shop to GameStop to trade stuff in. I didn't really have the time to clean them. At least my local GameStop, most of the associates are pretty nice and like they'll clean it for you just to make sure everything looks good. Others, if it's a mess, and then they'll just charge a refurb fee, whether it's something that can get wiped off or not. So I would definitely recommend cleaning your discs beforehand, even if it's something as simple as getting some water and a napkin, wiping them off that way. That's better than nothing. Ideally, you bring some disc cleaning wipes so you can like wipe down all your discs beforehand. But if you don't think of that ahead of time, just wipe down some water. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly cover condition when it comes to trading in GameStop, because that's a topic I didn't cover in the rest of the video. So let's get back to it. So now you've acquired your games. The next step is determining when to trade them in. And the best way to determine that, like I mentioned earlier, is promotions. So GameStop typically has a promotion going, at least one trade-in promotion going all the time. The most common is going to be the 20% extra credit when you trade towards certain games. That's one that you can pretty much always take advantage of, and you can do it one or two ways. If there happens to be a new game coming out that you want that is in that promotion, you can put all your games towards that game, and boom, you can get that game for less than what you would have paid out of pocket for it. That's a good way to go about it. However, let's say there's a game that isn't out yet that you don't really care for, but you want that extra credit. One thing you can do is put $5 on a pre-order of that game. That will give you the additional 20% credit, and then you can use that extra credit on whatever you want. So that's a good way to bump up your trade-in value, even if the games that are currently being used for that promotion aren't the greatest. So that's one good way to look at it. But yeah, then it's just a matter of going at the right time. The best promotions that you can find, and again, GameStop doesn't do these all the time, but when they do, it's a really good time to bring in any games that you were maybe considering trading in but just hadn't gotten around to yet. The best ones are going to be like 40 or 50% bonus credit days, which do happen sometimes. The 50% is a pretty rare one. That pretty much only happens if they're like dying for used games. Then they'll offer 50% extra credit. The other one is the more you trade, the more you get. Essentially how that works is they'll give you a set number of games where if you trade in this many games, you get this percent. If you trade in this many games, you get this percent. Usually it's like 20, 30, and 40%. So you just want to compile a large pile of games to trade in, and then you can get the largest percent. The last one, which again, I think is pretty uncommon over the last few years, is sometimes they have them where they'll just flat add additional credit. They did this before with like Xbox One, PS4, and I think Switch at one point they did this too, where every game for certain platforms that you trade in, they'll just give you an extra $5. Usually there's a minimum value amount on that, so you can't just trade in your old sports games and get like $5. Usually it's like you have to have a minimum of like $3 or $5, but then it becomes $8, so that's pretty darn good. So that's when you can kind of look for games that normally aren't worth trading in, but because of this promotion, they're worth hunting, and usually you can get those kinds of games for pretty cheap, so it works out in the end. So last couple things I want to talk about when it comes to GameStop trade-ins. Of course, we spent most of our time talking about games. You know, of course, GameStop takes other things other than games. They also take some electronics. They also take controllers, and they take consoles. Consoles, I would kind of stay away from for the most part. Personally, I don't like selling consoles. I did for a while when I just wanted to buy the new console and I didn't think I needed the old one. Obviously, I've wisened up to the fact that that's not necessarily the best move. Especially because older consoles can oftentimes become harder and harder to get, and by the time you're nostalgic and want to play your old games that are not backwards compatible, you can't, because that console is really hard to find. So unless you're like, you have a console that's just collecting dust and you're never going to use it, I would probably avoid trading in consoles to GameStop. Now, every now and again, they'll do promotions, like if you trade in a certain console, they'll give you $25 or $50 extra credit. I mean, sometimes you can get a decent deal for that. If you're looking to flip consoles, it's pretty rare, at least for me. I hunt primarily at pawn shops. It's pretty rare to find a console for that cheap. Like, pretty much all the pawn shops around me, like if they get a modern console, like a Switch, a PS4, I mean PS4 is not even modern, a PS5 or an Xbox, like the Series S is worth like $350. Maybe sometimes they'll sell it for $3. The Series X is probably $400, and then the PS5, sometimes they charge ludicrous amounts, even though they're common as a coal now. Like, they're not hard to find. But I've seen pawn shops try to sell PS5s for like $700-800, and like, they're not uncommon anymore. What are you doing? So Switches typically, at least based on my experience, usually like the Switch Lite's like $200, and then like a normal Switch is like $250, maybe a little less than that. Those kinds of numbers, like, it's good if you need a console, but if you're looking specifically to flip, you're not going to make anything off of that. So unless you can find a console for dirt cheap, like maybe that's where you want to do Facebook Marketplace or like, you know, something like that, or garage sales where you can find a really cheap console and then flip it to GameStop. It might work out, but based on my experience, that's not really how it works. Controllers are a little bit different. I have had a few times where controllers, I can find a controller for a surprisingly cheap price and then flip it to GameStop. Now, I will tell you this. Usually when they are doing a trade-in promotion, controllers are not included. So if there's like a percentage like extra, usually they do not include controllers in that. So every now and again, they'll do a specific controller related trade-in bonus. So I would probably say if you're thinking about trading in a controller, I would hold off until there's some sort of controller specific promotion, which don't come along that often. But otherwise, you're just going to get the base rate. Usually you're going to get the extra like 10% for that either. It's kind of just the base rate. So you can do okay on controllers if you find them really cheap, but otherwise you're probably not going to do that well with controllers. So I would say if you're looking to make the most out of your game hunting, I would probably stick with games. Make sure you buy games underneath the trade-in value price. Try to negotiate them as low as you can if possible. Always make sure you trade them in during a promotion. Even if it's the 20%, it's better than nothing. So don't just trade in games just to trade them in. You want to use some sort of promotion because, I mean, the base trade-ins are okay, but you want to get that little bit extra juice. So try to trade it in towards something. And then, you know, use pre-orders if you need to. If the 20% involves a pre-order, put $5 down on the game and then get that extra credit. So, yeah, that's kind of my Game Hunter 101 perspective on how to game hunt and succeed at doing well at GameStop. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully it was useful for those of you who haven't attempted to game hunt and trade stuff into GameStop. It's pretty much my bread and butter. Like, pretty much anytime I go out game hunting, I always have my GameStop app ready to go. I always look up game prices. If it's worth, usually my threshold, I mean, now everybody has a different threshold. If it's worth $5 or $6 in trading credit, if I can get it for under that, I'll go for it. I'm not going to bother with anything under $5 unless I get it for, like, ridiculously cheap. So, like, I've had a few games where it's only worth $4, but if I buy it for $1, it's like, okay, sure. But, I mean, after a while, it comes to a point where it's not even worth buying if you're only going to get, like, $1 or $2 out of it. So, but yeah, try to buy whatever you can for under the trade-in value. Combine it with trading credit bonuses, and bada bing, bada boom. You can get yourself some brand new games or some retro games or some pre-owned games for a lot less than if you bought them out of pocket. So that's going to do it for this first ever episode of Game Hunter 101. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. And yeah, I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.